So just a quick catch up. Last week we talked about how King Jeroboam had just taken control over the kingdom of Israel, and his governing decisions led to a split. So now there's two tribes of Israel once again, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. In the northern kingdom, you have King Ahab, and King Ahab was married to Jezebel. Jezebel brought with her the history and traditions of the Baal prophets. So out of nowhere, Elijah appears. And Elijah, speaking on behalf of God, remember he's a prophet, he tells King Ahab that it will not rain until the northern kingdom with King Ahab and Queen Jezebel quits worshiping the Baal gods. Now, in Israel, in the desert, rain is everything, right? It's the sustenance, it's life, it's how you survive. King Ahab starts to panic, and for 3 years, there is a severe drought. Not a drop of water falls on the ground. And King Ahab becomes desperate. He sends out his people to try to find green blades of grass for the cattle. He sends out his servant Obadiah to find anything that the cattle can eat. And in this search, Elijah appears, and Obadiah runs to get King Ahab. So Ahab confronts Elijah and says, Elijah, this is all of your fault. You said it wasn't going to rain, and now it's not going to rain. And Elijah says, it's not my fault, it's your fault. You are worshiping all of those false gods, the gods of Baal. Baal, just a little bit of Israel history here, like we could have had at the trivia night. Baal was the god of storms, the god of rain. So there's a bit of Israelite irony there. The God of rain, the God of storms can't produce any rain. And Elijah says to King Ahab, how long are you going to recognize that you're making a mistake here? I tell you what, says Elijah, let's have a final showdown. Let's see who really has the one true God. So King Ahab agrees. So the showdown takes place on Mount Carmel. I may have prompted Annabelle on that answer, sorry. Elijah wants to demonstrate that he's not trying to pull a fast one here. So Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, and by the way, there are 450 of them and just one of Elijah. Elijah says, why don't you guys go first? I want to give you every chance that you have. So 450 prophets, they line up on Mount Carmel, and all day long they try to call on their God, the gods of Baal, to do something. And the text in the history says that they try everything. They cut themselves with swords. They scream out loud. They flagellate themselves. They scream to the heavens. They beg for their God to rain down water, and nothing happens. And Elijah mocks them. And this is, again, an example of ancient humor. If you read about this story in 1 King, Elijah says, cry louder. Maybe your God is meditating or absent. But if you're like a Hebrew Greek or Hebrew scholar, if you go back there and look at the translation, it doesn't really say maybe your God is meditating. The Hebrew line actually says maybe your God is out in the bathroom. But anyway, the Baal God will not answer. All 450 prophets try it out, and then Elijah steps up. And this is where our scripture ends up for today from 1 Kings chapter 18. Elijah says to all of the people, so all of the 450 prophets gathered there, he says, come closer to me. And all of the people came closer to him. And he repaired first the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. And he took the 12 stones, which probably represent the 12 tribes of Israel and the tribes of the sons of Jacob. And he says, Israel shall be your name. And with those stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And then he made a trench around the altar, large enough to contain 2 measures of seed. And next he put the wood in the order, and then he cut the bull in pieces. He laid it on the wood. He said, fill 4 jars with water. Remember, they're trying all day to get the water to come, so he fills it with water. He pours it on the burnt offering and the wood. He says, do it a second time, and a second time, and again, he says, do it a third time, so they do it a third time. So now there is this trench filled with water, and the irony again there is that water has what the Baal prophets have been praying for, and also that if something is soaked in water, it is hard to light. And then Elijah calls out to Yahweh, and Elijah says, answer me, Lord. And instantly, everything, including the stones, it's consumed by fire, and it's left smoldering in ashes. And it says that the 450 prophets of Baal, they instantly fall down and start worshiping Yahweh. It's this moment of instant conversion. Now, that's quite a story, right? But what does it have to say to us today? Here's what I think. I think Elijah proves that God, as we know through the faith of our ancestors in the Old Testament and the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament, exists and responds. Well, someone might say, okay, so Elijah had this and the God came down and the fires rained from heaven, but things like that don't usually happen today. And I would agree, right? It's not too often that God spews down fire and smolders everything in sight. But remember a couple weeks ago when we were studying the leaders of the Old Testament, and Moses is standing up on a different mountain, but Moses is standing up on Mount Sinai and looking over the promised land, and Moses says to the people of Israel, remember that time when God came and spoke to us and gave us the covenants? Only Moses is not factually right because that generation hadn't yet existed, but he says it as if it did. In other words, when the ancestors of our faith experience something, we can share that same experience with them. This is a tradition that the Jewish people really pick up on, but it's this idea that we don't have to have the internal pressure of trying to prove that God already exists because someone else who has gone before us has already done that. In other words, with the ancestors of our faith, and if you think about today and the life of the church, today is a day to celebrate All Saints' Day, so the saints of the church who have gone before us. Yesterday was the Day of the Dead, where you're supposed to remember in the Catholic tradition the saints in your own lives. October 31st is All Hallows' Eve. The idea is that people go before you and they have these experiences of faith, and while you may not have had the exact same experience, you can share that experience with them. And then there's something else, I think. On Mount Carmel, Elijah talks about the danger of following false gods. And those gods of Baal, even though we don't use that word anymore today, still exist. Think about the way those gods exist today. It's the gods of consumerism, right? Or nationalism, or militarism, or careerism, if that's a word. Whatever it may be that we create ourselves. And what do we create ourselves? We tend to create, right? Wealth, or health, or prosperity, or success, or whatever it is. But if you only pursue those goals, you end up living in insecurity. Now, the late author David Wallace said it like this: in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, and I think he's exactly right here, there is actually no such thing as atheism. I think he's 100% right. There's no such thing as not worshiping. There is no religious neutrality. Everybody worships. The only choice we have, though, is what we decide to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing someone like Jesus Christ is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap into real meaning in life, you'll never have enough. If you worship your body and your beauty, you're never going to feel pretty enough. When time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. If you worship power, you're going to end up feeling weak and afraid and insecure. You'll need more power over others to numb your own fear. If you worship your intellect, if being smart is most important to you, you're always going to feel like you're a fraud on the verge of being found out. And then he says the insidious forms of all of these are unconscious. They are the default settings for human beings, the kind of worship you just gradually slip into every single day. The theologian John Calvin also picked up on this idea when he said the human heart naturally creates its own false idols. It's almost like as Jeannie did during the children's moment with the tray of pizza set before us. We get to choose what we want to worship. So the text for today, the part that I read, is what's called the lectionary reading for the day. And it pretty much ends there with the 450 people falling down to worship Yahweh. But there's another line that happens right after it. And I don't think it does justice if you don't say it. After those 450 people fall down and worship Yahweh, the next line of the text says, then Elijah led all 450 prophets down the hill and instantly killed them. We tend to leave that part out. But you can't dance around the fact, right? If you only pick and choose, well, that's not a good theology. And I don't know if it's revenge or justice or politics or just plain out violence, whatever, it happens there. But then there's another line after that we also leave out. And I like this line better. After Elijah has killed all the prophets, he says to King Ahab, well, let's go up to the top of the mountain now and eat some food and have something to drink and watch the rain come down. In other words, Elijah says, that covenant that you, King Ahab, made with God and with Israel, you got a little off track, but it's still there. It still exists. There are always second chances and hope for the future. Elijah was an enigma. He kind of shows up out of nowhere. He kind of disappears after the story. He took a really strong stance on what he believed. But what he does is he reminds us of the possibilities that still exist. Most of us, I think, and I would include myself in this, are like King Ahab, right? We're full of indecision. We know what we want to do, but we don't always follow through with it. And then there are consequences, and then we reevaluate. And so we need those moments in our lives when we can have someone like Elijah who says to us, remember that promise God made with you? It still exists for you today. And you can find that in the breaking of the bread and the drinking of the cup and the refreshing rain that comes from God. And for this we give thanks, and we say together, Amen.